Hey guys, it's Shay, or as I'm known on TikTok, Flight Nurse Shay, and this is my brother Tyler, and he's on TikTok as MusicMedic4477. And today I brought him on so that we can discuss some questions that I frequently get on my lives, and it's about paramedic students. So he is a paramedic instructor. He also still works as a paramedic. I thought he'd be the perfect guest to kind of dive into this.
It's a fun note. Still works as a paramedic. You gotta add that as a caveat.
Well, that is true. Sometimes,
this is not a those that can't do teach situation.
Yeah, that was exactly the quote I was going to use. But yes, he still practices in real life, so he stays up to date on things that are happening in the real world. And he does teach students as well. So I'm just going to throw at you some of the questions I frequently get on my lives, and you can kind of maybe give us some perspective. So as some of you may know, I did a non-traditional paramedic program. Out of high school, I went to a community college and started a paramedic program, but I didn't make it all the way through. I only got my EMT and I didn't finish. I actually ended up doing a RN to paramedic bridge a little bit later in my career. So my perspective is different than someone who does a traditional paramedic program.
You started a paramedic program?
I did. At 18, I started, and then
learn something new every day.
Actually, your wife's dad told me, you're going to make way more money as a nurse. What are you doing going to paramedic school?
He's
and
not
I
wrong.
said, Chuck, you're right. And I stopped paramedic school and I actually went to nursing school.
But then you came back over because you remembered how awesome they are?
Yes, I never wanted to be in the hospital. I always wanted to be in the pre-hospital setting. But finishing my paramedic felt like a goal that I hadn't reached. And nurses that cross over and get their paramedic license but don't work on a truck, I just feel like have no respect for anybody in the paramedic field. And I knew that even though I'd been flying as a flight nurse for 5 years and doing all those advanced skills, I knew if I didn't actually work in a truck, I wouldn't really have a leg to stand on. So it was a goal of mine to finish my degree and actually work on an ambulance.
Congratulations.
Yes, thank you. All right, Tyler, so let's start with one of the most common questions that I get is for future paramedic students who usually have their EMT, haven't started paramedic school, and want to know if there's anything they need to do to prepare before they start classes.
So that's kind of an interesting question. I mean, yes, things like anatomy and physiology, brush up. Some courses will have A&P as a prerequisite. Some courses will deliver an A&P as kind of a homogenized section of the course. So didactically, there's stuff that you can brush up on. I think the more important component, though, you get these differing schools of thought, and you'll have some people who are like, well, you should get lots of experience as an EMT before you go to paramedic school. And I don't inherently agree with that perspective, only because so much of our formative paramedic education is spent undoing horrible habits that people learn from working in the field too long before they go to become a paramedic. So we just have to undo a bunch of stuff and then reteach them how to be a good EMT before we can add in the critical thinking component.
I like that a lot. And I feel like we don't tell nurses you have to work as a CNA or LPN before you can be an RN, because people feel pretty confidently that you're going to learn what you are supposed to know to be an RN in RN school. I feel like it's probably similar for paramedic school.
It's like anytime they try to add something to a formulary or a scope of practice, like, well, you can teach EMTs to do that. Of course you can. It's called paramedic school.
That's a good point. So pretty much when they go and speak with their advisor, they're going to tell them what the prerequisites are. They should already be taking those courses. On a personal level, though, it's not like they need to start studying something before they get to school, because they'll learn what they need to know in class, right?
I think that's largely the case. I will also say, get in touch with whatever program you're interested in way ahead of time, especially if they're cultivating a good reputation. Our program currently has a waiting list of about 60 students for 35 spots. And the days of being able to interview or contact a program a few months before the next class starts and expect to get a spot is becoming a thing of the past if the program's worth its salt. So reach out, find out what you need, find out what the prereq qualifications are, and work on getting them ahead of time so you don't find yourself behind the curve when it comes time to register, apply to the college.
Made me think of a very interesting question that I wasn't going to ask you, but now I want to know.
Okay.
If you have such a large waiting list, how do you guys decide who gets in and who doesn't?
So there is a first come, first served component, but every applicant to our program is interviewed by the program director. So they have a one-on-one via Zoom, just like kind of a job interview. There's some, pathophys, EMT scope of practice type questions, and then just some character assessment that goes on. and then it's who contacted first. If we have multiple students finishing a prereq coming into the program at the same time, then it will go by the ID number they're issued by the college when they first apply.
Oh, wow.
So we kind of stick to the first come, first serve if we have multiple qualified applicants. Interestingly enough, we've been getting having a frank conversation, like you might not get in this year, and these are other programs available to you. And we're getting a lot of, no thanks, I'll wait till next year.
Because they really want to
comments because they really want to come.
So in general, if we weren't talking about just your program, because I know you view your program in high regards.
Your mileage may vary.
Would you recommend applying to multiple schools then? Just like you might if you were trying to get into a nursing school and weren't sure.
So possibly. That's very much going to depend on the individual learner. Mm-hmm. Some people know what they want and will not accept something else. Some people, especially your higher end of the class in terms of performance, like if you want to be a good provider, you will be a good provider regardless of where you go. You'll get out what you put into it. Some programs, I think, excel at appealing to that middle of the herd, right? The ones who could go either way. Mm-hmm. So if you're concerned about your strengths and weaknesses and how they're going to be catered to, then make sure you've vetted the program you're interested in well. Make sure you know what they're going to offer to you.
That is good advice.
Ask other people who have been through programs in your area. Mm-hmm. It's very common that you will see a consensus developing among them as to where you should put your efforts.
That's good advice. I like it. All right, so the next question I get a lot is for students who are already in school, they want to know what is a good way to tackle concepts that they're struggling with that they're currently studying in school.
That's a good question. Sorry. No, go ahead.
I was going to say, because for me, I did an all-online program, and I only interacted infrequently with my instructors via Zoom when we had some live sessions. I usually tell them that if you're struggling with a concept, to just reach out to the instructor personally and ask for extra help, but I don't know if that is good advice.
No, that's very good advice. You took the words right out of my mouth. I find that the habit among paramedic students, because, and again, I can only speak to our frame of reference, we're cramming 2 years in any other college worth of educational material into a year certification process.
Right.
They have greatly increased the national education standard. A lot of programs have not necessarily increased the time in which they're delivering that content. So it's like drinking from a fire hose. At times it's going to feel overwhelming, and the biggest mistake students make is waiting too long to realize they're behind. So they kind of sit there and suffer in silence and presume that they're going to hit some magical transition point where things start to click. There is a macro to that. Like, you start wondering when the entire class is going to turn, and you see it happen toward the end of the year. But if you're sitting there and you see that your peers, your classmates, are getting things, they're clicking with concepts, they're answering questions well, and you're going, I don't know what the heck they're talking about. That might be a red flag, and you need to jump on those things early and go to your instructor for help. Don't suffer in silence. Find somebody to help you with these concepts. And then there's a lot of extra stuff you can do in terms of study technique, test taking strategy and techniques. The biggest hole I think people fall into is the trap of information recognition versus actually retaining information. So you make flashcards, and then you see a flashcard and you go, oh yeah, I remember what that is. But you don't remember what that is. You're recognizing information when you see it again. And you really need to engage active recall. Have somebody else that can hold you accountable.
So study with a partner?
Study with a partner, and preferably study with a partner who knows what they're talking about. There's a certain extent. Somebody can sit there and they can read a flashcard and be like, yes, you got that. So they don't necessarily have to be like a content expert.
Sure.
But if you have somebody that can help guide and facilitate that study, then obviously it's more worth the effort. But yeah, don't fall into the recognition pattern. Okay. Things looking familiar is not enough. You actually need to get it from your hippocampus into your neocortex. The only way to do that is active recall.
I like that. That's an excellent point. Okay, the last question that I was going to ask today is, I find that a lot of people feel nervous as they get towards the end of school about transitioning to being the provider on the ambulance and feeling maybe a little bit of sense of inadequacy. Like, I just went from school and I had my instructors, my preceptors to fall back on, and now I'm expected to be the one that knows what to do, and I feel really anxious. What advice would you have for students who are going out there for the first time being the paramedic on the ambulance?
Well, firstly, I think it's important we acknowledge that that's a understandable emotion to be experiencing, to feel a little bit out of your depth, especially when all of that responsibility truly is yours.
And it's a lot.
It's not up to somebody else. It's a lot. Some of that is managed by time and just diving into the pool. But I think there's something to be said for, you can compensate for lack of hands-on experience to an extent with good training. There's a saying that practice makes perfect. Mm-hmm. Well, that's nonsense, because you can practice something a lot inappropriately and get really good at doing something bad, right? So Connie Matera, who's an educator from out in Illinois, had the saying, perfect practice makes perfect, right? Yes. So make sure that the way you're preparing is truly what the expectation is when you get out into the field. And this kind of goes back to vet the program you're interested in. Mm-hmm. Especially as we got into the pandemic, you found a lot of programs that were supplementing in-field clinical with simulation and reducing the amount of actual field clinical mm-hmm. time that students were getting on the ambulance. So find out what the clinical process looks like for the program that you're interested in. Yeah. Make sure you're going to get hundreds of hours being responsible for patient care. Mm-hmm. Yes, with a safety net, but it truly gives you an opportunity to flesh out those concepts and exercise your critical thinking ability before you're expected to make important decisions on your own. You know, you can bounce those off of your safety net. Yeah. And then, of course, you know, there's always the risk that your preceptor might not be the best thing in terms of, mm-hmm. you know, we put students out sometimes, and frankly, it's where we have the least amount of control, right? Yeah. Who they end up with in the field. Right. And sometimes, if their formative education is good, you might be coming from a place where you're a little more competent than the person that you're paired with. Hopefully that's not the case, but you can still learn a lot from a bad preceptor. Maybe that's going to be what you don't want to do instead of what you do want to do.
That is a good point.
Be confident, but not cocky. And yeah, that can be a thin line for providers mm-hmm. sometimes. Yeah. We don't need more para-ego. It's the enemy of progress.
Yeah. You bring up a good point. It's something I usually give advice to when people ask this question is find the person that you can go to bounce those calls off of and say, hey, how would you have run this? Or what did you do wrong? Or maybe it's the person that you actually text in the moment and say, I just need your opinion on this. Find your safety net. Find somebody that you trust in the organization that you start working for, that you know can have your back and support you and even help you make better decisions.
Absolutely.
I love it. That is some excellent advice, Tyler. Thank you so much for the perspective.
My pleasure.
We're going to end this YouTube in one of our favorite ways. We have written down questions that neither of us have seen, and we're going to ask each other, and you're going to get the answers on the spot. All right, Tyler, here's yours with the T.
Who's going first?
You.
A moment you felt very proud of a student, either when they were in school or sometime after they started working. This stuff happens all the time. I mean, one of my favorite things about being in education is watching students run past you. Students going into med school or ending up in aeromedical, like all for a chopper, and they're the one that steps off of the skid. Like, that's a very cool feeling. Specifically, I had an opportunity to intern a student last year who was one of ours, but I actually got him in the field as well. And they started calling him Little Tyler, which I was assured was a compliment and not necessarily an insult. So that was pretty neat. And he has continued to cultivate an excellent relationship, and then just got another job working for a county-based EMS system. And I was told, yeah, if you have 20 more of him, we'd be happy to staff our agency that way. So yeah, I mean, it happens all the time, but specifically, he's one of the more recent ones that comes to mind.
Cool. Well, if that's you and you're watching this, that is a huge compliment. I'm super happy for you. All right, let's see what you're. I always get nervous. What exciting tech or skill is on the horizon for air, medical, or even ground? That's a good question. We were talking about ultrasound earlier. I definitely feel like we have started to integrate that a lot into air medical, and I am now starting to see it on the ground as well. I think sometimes it's a expense cost, sometimes it's an education issue where the parties there don't feel like they know enough about it to educate everybody. But I think that there's a lot of really good resources that actually come out and teach you how to do ultrasound and do ultrasound workshops. So I think that that's what we're going to see a lot more, is everybody having that tool and knowing how to use it even past just a fast exam.
Cool. What is advice you find yourself giving a lot or repeatedly? Something you find has to be repeated because it's difficult for students to grasp.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think I had one of these moments recently. It's not necessarily one that's solicited a ton. It is occasionally, but it's
I'm really curious.
It's one that we do have to harp on pretty frequently, and that's so I'll tell a short story. A student came up to me at the end of this year and they said, "I'm curious what recommendations you have onto how to keep getting smarter." And essentially what she was asking is, how do I not fall into the trap that so many people working in medicine fall into? And that is, we have formative education, where you learn about, how to be a nurse or a paramedic. You have institutional learning, where you go and actually learn how to operate at the place you're working. Mm-hmm. And then we stop.
Or we just have monthly education, most people go.
Right. Which is repetitive medical education. It's not continuing medical education.
That's fair.
And essentially this comes down to a culture thing. Like, with the amount of resources available to us, we have no excuse for settling on the things that, or settling for the things we don't know. If we have questions, we need to be able to go out and answer them. And I tell students all the time, if you leave our program with something, the best thing that could possibly be is how to keep learning. Mm-hmm. Because this is true. It's formative education. It's just the beginning. So I get that a lot. Like, where do you recommend we go from here, kind of thing? Yeah. And that is, find out how to advocate for your own education continually, and don't settle for the things you don't know. Right.
So that could look like, well, for one, most journals are free online. So if there's a concept that you don't understand, you should be searching it from a scholarly article and doing evidence-based practice that way.
Please, something peer-reviewed, not just YouTube videos.
Some people find it hard to just read and understand. They're more visual learners, so you may want to get a subscription to like an EMS education site that does visual classes that you can actually watch. And then, of course, there is, a body of peers, like in a QA system. So like if you have a chart and you are QAing it, that's a good way for you to get advice and give advice and stay up to date on stuff as well.
Yeah.
What are your feelings on attempting blade insertion pre-paralytic during RSI? So this actually reminds me of a question someone asked me recently on how I felt about drug-only assisted intubation. Now, this would probably be an entirely different YouTube, but my answer was your first attempt should be your best attempt. And I truly feel like if you have the resources to have the paralytic, then why would you not make your first attempt your best attempt? Why would I attempt the blade and then realize that, the patient actually has a gag reflex and now I've got vomit everywhere and oh man, where did my suction go? It fell on the floor.
Especially when your aspiration of gastric contents is like an astronomical increase in morbidity and mortality percentages.
I guess so. Yeah, maybe we'll do another YouTube on the difference in RSI and DSI, but for now, I'm not a huge fan. I think you should set yourself up to have your best attempt on your first attempt, and putting the blade in is your first attempt.
My question to people who advocate for drugs only or sedation only intubation is, why are you so rushed in the procedure that you can't afford the time for the paralytic?
So some ground agencies, they just don't have it.
Right, I understand it. And then that's
access
and availability thing, which is a different conversation.
But when you do have it, I just can't not imagine, because, I think the conversation back when there was the whole sucks and rock thing, and why would you give one over the other? And, obviously there's some contradictions. But the whole idea was, the time that the patient's paralyzed should never be the question, because that patient's getting an airway.
Right.
whether it's a backup airway, whether it's a surgical or that patient,
they still need to be sedated
still
and
needs an
paralyzed.
airway. Whether they're paralyzed or not, they still need an airway. That's the whole reason that you were in that situation. So that is like a huge argument for me on why would you attempt and
if time management is a thing,
yeah.
then you didn't pre-resuscitate your patient prior to trying to intubate them.
Bingo.
And RSI is not a crash airway.
Bingo. Yep. There's a big difference in DSI, RSI, and then just truly having an actual crash airway, and that is very different. So excellent point. I appreciate it. Thanks, Tyler.